easily one of the greatest things about conferences like BCS is that side conversations that happen between sessions. So please do reach out, ask questions, share thoughts after the sessions with me in the coming weeks. Reach out on email, LinkedIn, whatever. Um, I miss chatting with you folks in person. Now, what am I here to talk about? Well, a common theme in design technology is that we don't have enough resources to accomplish what we would like to do. There are a lot of reasons for that, but it got me wondering how much of one particular resource is appropriate to have in a healthy digital practice. Time, overhead time. As far back as I can remember, there's been an adage that you want 1 hour of BIM development time for every full time BIM user. But the more I asked peers about that, no one could point me to where that came from, other than just it was a gut feeling. It was something they'd heard. So I decided to try and figure it out for myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about what information I was looking for, how I decided to gather that information, how I processed that information, and what it tells us. What was I looking for? Frankly, I'm often swamped at work. So many of us are. Firm leadership is aware of that and trying to alleviate that problem, but I needed to be able to quantify how much help might actually be reasonable and useful. But every firm is different. What works for one firm may be totally impractical in another, and different firms have different levels of BIM adoption that are based on their individual practice needs. Where one firm might benefit from really dialed in, customized workflows specific to their practice, another might be better off with a really flexible approach. I didn't want to get stuck with outlier data, so I set out to find enough folks and find out what they're actually doing to find out what's reasonable, what's a good starting point. Now, fair warning, I'm a BIM manager and have learned to read between the lines and ask questions to get the information that I need to troubleshoot things. But I am not a polling expert. I am not a data scientist. Although I did dig into things enough that I believe that I've got some actionable data. And I'm going to keep studying this. So, I asked questions about country, firm name, role, and market sector within AEC. These were to allow for cultural and regional practice differences. I asked about firm names so I could deduplicate answers, but then I also asked about role for potential data weighting. I didn't get enough answers to dig into that, but do we trust what a BIM manager is saying more than a CEO or a rendering intern? Maybe, maybe not. A key thing I wanted to understand is if firms who have a more advanced BIM workflow are staffing differently than folks who are using it in a more limited fashion. So I didn't want to get fancy with terms that might confuse things, that someone's going to interpret a little bit differently. So I took a really, really simple, open ended almost set of breakouts. I asked what level of folks were working with it as a firm, and then I asked how well they felt supported within their staff. Was there enough BIM support? I'm not going to go through every question here, but I tried to separate truly non-billable BIM overhead hours from general project focused billable BIM support and to break that out from other elements. So I also asked about IT in the hopes of getting some control information. IT overhead numbers are pretty widely reported across industries. And I wanted to see a bigger picture of design technology as many pictures are moving towards grouping BIM and IT staff together under one coordinated umbrella and to see if those were the same, a little bit different. Um, I was specific to mention billable versus non billable overhead. And then I asked how much time folks actually worked and how many hours their firm contributed to BIM overhead tasks to other related tasks such as IT, more dedicated project BIM experts, and finally, how many various sorts of staff were at each firm. The idea being, I didn't want an electrical contractor who has 1,000 electricians but 10 BIM modelers and one full-time BIM overhead manager to skew numbers by saying that one full-time overhead person was supporting 1,000 employees rather than the 10 BIM users they were actually supporting. One of the measures that I wanted to look at most closely was the ratio of overhead support staff to the general production staff. From the questions I got and the answers I got, I generated a ratio based on the hours worked. So that we could see if a half-time BIM manager at a 20-person firm was getting similar results to a full-time BIM manager at a 40-person firm. I looked for the overall hours being reported going into BIM overhead versus the overall hours theoretically being reported by the firm. As I talk about this, I'm going to simplify things a bit. It's much easier to think about one BIM manager for 30 design staff versus 50 design staff. Uh, as you take numbers back to your firm, recognize that one BIM overhead position does not necessarily mean one full-time role, just that it's approximately the same total hours that one person would work, possibly by one person, possibly with spread out responsibilities. Overall, I got 99 responses to my poll, which doesn't seem like a lot. But the cool thing about polling is that you often don't need as large a sample size as one might think to get statistically significant answers. I took all the answers and shoved them into Power BI and discovered that I had a hot mess and that I'm really bad at Power BI visualizations, which you'll see in a moment here. I used initial visualizations to identify the worst outliers and discovered that many of them were the only data point that I had in that area. For example, a firm that had thousands of employees in the tech sector wasn't necessarily representative of general architectural practice, so I eliminated those outliers. Looking at national makeup, I'm sure in no small part due to where I'm from and where I know the most folks, I had a majority of answers from the USA, so I filtered for them specifically so that I had a hopefully cleaner data set. Now, I was starting to see some actual appreciable trends in the data, but from personal experience, I knew that we have massive variations in practice methodology from large firms to small firms. Now, personally, I suspect that practical differences occur at different points than those large firm and small firm breaks, but I needed some way to figure out if I had a statistically useful sample. Now, in the USA, the American Institute of Architects releases an annual firm survey report, and it classifies firms into small, medium, and large size firms. Medium and large are medium is 10 employees, or sorry, under medium is 10 to 49 employees, and over 50 is large. Now, there's a lot of firms that are a whole lot bigger than a 50. And while not classified in the AI report, they're documented elsewhere. And as I was able to dig into the visualizations, I discovered that I probably didn't have a large enough sample size for the relatively small number of truly mega firms. So I eliminated firms over 500 bodies. Now, with the number of firms in each size category and a number of responses from the USA and their respective firm sizes and a fancy online calculator that would give me like how accurate my sample size was and what I could hope from it, I was able to determine that in theory, for mid and large size firms, excluding mega firms in the United States, there's enough data to have probably less than a 5% margin of error in these answers. Now, I'm not going to claim these are perfect numbers, but there are very clear trends that appear to be statistically significant, even within that relatively small margin of error. So while the interesting parts of the data are focused on firms between 10 and 500 bodies in the USA, I think there's some very, very clear trends within that are worth talking about. So the big question, what's the average BIM overhead support rate? It's 53.01 users per single BIM overhead staffer. So no, a little bit higher than that 40 rule of thumb, but not crazy. Now, if you have a firm with 53 BIM production users and one full-time BIM support person, you are perfectly average in the USA for mid and large size firms. But that's not really useful or actionable information. First and foremost, there were no respondents to low levels of adoption. That's pretty interesting. Everyone had moved beyond just using their BIM anchor software as fancy 3D CAD. Now, that's pretty awesome in and of itself as a report on the state of the industry. But there's a definite downward trend that as the level of adoption uh, of BIM workflows goes up, the ratio of BIM overhead to users drops. So the average firm with moderate levels of adoption had a ratio of about 62 users to one BIM staff. When we moved up to a mature BIM workflow and BIM practice, adoption was down to 53 users to one BIM staff. And for the self-reported advanced BIM environments, it was down to below 30 users per one BIM overhead staffer. Now, that alone is quite indicting and indicates that using BIM workflows in a more advanced manner really does require a higher support ratio than most firms are currently investing in. Now, as a sanity check, the reported level of IT environment and IT support ratio also dropped in a similar way for a better IT environment versus a worse IT environment. If you reported a poor IT environment, odds are you had a higher IT staff to user ratio, according to the poll. Now, we've got some correlation that this is a useful piece of information that a lower BIM overhead support ratio produces better results, but that's not necessarily the whole picture. And that's not really the cool data yet. Ignoring for the moment that it really looks like we need to have a higher level of BIM overhead to get a higher level of BIM practice. Remember that I also asked about the perception of if BIM staffing is adequate. This is where things really started to get interesting. Firms that reported that their BIM overhead levels were significantly inadequate were relatively few, but had the highest overhead staffing at over 74 full-time users per single support person. That's massive. When folks described their firm with slow progress and less than ideal, we were down to about 55 users per overhead role. Now, that's statistically about the average we were at, or within the margin of error for the average for everybody. So we're probably seeing that most folks are seeing less than ideal advancements. Now, once things were described as adequate, we were down to about 34 users per overhead staff. And now here's the interesting bit. Once we got to firms whose staff felt they were making progress and really getting ahead, we were back up to about 42 users per overhead staff. And that fell down again to 27 users per overhead staffer when firms were saying they were doing really cool new stuff and had extra bandwidth. Remember when I said I wasn't great with Power BI? Yeah, I had help, and this is the slide you got. So why is there that bump at good? There were only a handful of firms who reported that they were really getting ahead in the excellent range, but they were also the firms who reported that they're at the top of the game for BIM adoption. At the good getting ahead bump up to about 42 users per overhead BIM staff, we see firms who are self-reporting that they're at the step down at mature BIM workflows. What I think is happening is that what we're seeing is once you've gotten through the development and built solid workflows, that ratio can creep back up a bit. That where we're seeing that initial ratio drop is where firms have not committed enough development time to get where they want to go. And the numbers below those outliers are really pushing the envelope, or numbers way out at the end of the great stuff are really pushing the envelope in the experimental process rather than just focusing on the more day-to-day business where it can start to creep up again. They've kept those investments and kept digging into them. So to get ahead, the mid to upper 30s range is what gives the perception of moving forward, which coincides with the decreases seen in staffing ratio to overall BIM adoption level. So while most respondents reported that their firms were in the moderate to mature levels of BIM, they also reported an average of 1 to 50, uh, and progress being slower than desired. So that should come as no surprise that as the reported level of overhead went up, the level of adoption very clearly also went up. Only firms reporting the most overhead had the highest adoption level, and the firms with the reported worst overhead levels were also at the lowest levels of BIM adoption. Okay, so enough boring graphs. I mean, you only saw a couple of them, but how many BIM staff do you need? Well, it really depends on what you want to do and where you're at. There are two parts of how to look at these numbers that I'm currently seeing. One is that in order to really provide the perception of progressing ahead in digital practice, mid and large size firms in the USA probably want to be at a ratio below 35 BIM users per dedicated BIM overhead role. I say that due to the strong correlation between improved perception of progress by their BIM involved staff and their self reported current level of BIM practice. But once those firms have reached whatever level they deem adequate for their particular practice, they can probably start to let that creep up to the low 40s. However, by the time you have a ratio of one BIM support staff per 50 users, your progress will slow appreciably. Now, does that mean you can't make progress with a higher ratio? Not at all. There are folks who are crazy good at the jobs and crazy efficient, and there are firms that are able to just slog through and d- invest that time over the long haul. But for the average staffer and for the average role, you statistically do not have a good chance of maintaining or improving your digital practice. Now, as a side note, IT staffing ratio, uh, getting ahead and making progress in developing new IT things is about 1 to 50, uh, with 1 to 63 as adequate and 1 to 68 as average, which vaguely jives with general IT industry numbers and certainly seems to correlate to BIM overhead staffing trends. So we're not entirely crazy there. So where do we go from here? Well, I'm running the poll again. I want more data. I'd love to be able to split this out and be able to see how economies of scale impact this at more granular segments of firms. I'd love to be able to see how this holds true in other countries and in other regions, and if there's appreciable differences. I've got so many more questions now that I've seen the beginnings of some data. So I'm running the poll again, and you are all very invited to take it. Uh, the more responses I get, the better we can dig into these questions. Here's a link. Link at the bottom is the same as QR code, depending on what is easier for you to get to. And you can reach out to me by email. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm going to also expand this poll with a more in-depth version, hopefully this winter. I want to look at some other things like software use, overall time, time in various tasks like license management, like template setup, all sorts of different things like that that are a little more granular. Now, if you signed up for the original poll and asked for information, you'll be getting that in about the month or so. And if you are better at Power BI or have a burning question you think would give further insight that you'd like included in a the more advanced poll, please reach out to me. I clearly need help with Power BI, but I also really want to hear from you. Was this helpful and insightful? Not useful at all? Any feedback you can give is appreciated. And I really hope I get to speak to you all in person at the next BIM Coordinator Summit. Thank you all.